When she walked through the door that evening, I could sense something was off. She had a strange look in her eyes, a mixture of excitement and mischief. I was sitting at the dinner table halfway through my meal when she sauntered in, kicking off her heels with a careless flick. Without even a hello, she announced with a smirk, "I am going out now. I hope you won't be too jealous." The words hung in the air, making me choke on the bite of food I was chewing. It wasn't just what she said, but how she said it. There was no concern, no hesitation, just a cold, calculated confidence. She didn't care what I thought or felt. Our marriage had been rocky for a while, sure, but this was a new low. I could feel the anger rising, but I kept my cool, not wanting to give her the satisfaction of seeing me riled up. Our daughter, who had just come into the room, overheard the whole thing. She was about to ask me something when she froze, eyes wide. "What do you mean? Are you leaving us for a lover?" she shouted, her voice a mix of shock and disbelief. Her mother didn't even flinch. In fact, she laughed a harsh, cruel sound that sent chills down my spine. "Oh, yes, your father is a typical loser, so I need a stand-up strong man." It was like she was goading me, pushing me to react. And maybe she was, but I wasn't going to give her that. I was hurt, sure, but I was more furious. How dare she? How dare she flaunt her affair so openly, so cruelly? It was like she wanted me to know, to suffer. I didn't say anything I couldn't. I just stared at her, my mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. She didn't even wait for a response. She grabbed her coat and purse, looking back at me with that same smug expression before turning on her heel and walking out the door. I heard the engine of her car roar to life, and then she was gone. For a moment, I just sat there, stunned. This wasn't the woman I married. This wasn't the life I had imagined. I felt an overwhelming sense of betrayal, but also a strange clarity. This couldn't go on. Something had to be done, and she deserved to face the consequences of her actions. She thought she could just walk all over me, humiliate me in front of our child, and get away with it. But she was wrong. I was going to make sure she paid for this, in the cruelest way possible. This was only the beginning. I had a lot to think about, and even more to plan. Revenge is a dish best served cold, and I was going to make sure it was ice cold by the time I was through with her. The days that followed were a blur of emotions. I was swinging between anger, sadness, and a burning desire for revenge. The image of her laughing, mocking me in front of our daughter, replayed in my mind over and over again. It was like a wound that refused to heal, growing deeper with each passing day. I started paying more attention to her behavior, little things I had ignored or brushed off before. Late nights at work, hushed phone calls in the other room, unexplained absences. She was careful, but not careful enough. She didn't realize I was watching her now, taking mental notes of every slip-up. One night, as she was getting ready to go out again, I decided to test the waters. "Where are you headed tonight?" I asked, my tone casual as if I were genuinely curious. She barely looked up from the mirror where she was applying her makeup. "Out with some friends," she said nonchalantly, her reflection showing no hint of guilt. "Which friends?" I pressed, keeping my voice steady. She paused for a split second, just long enough for me to notice. "Just some girls from work." "You wouldn't know them." It was a lie. I knew it, and I could see she knew that I knew. But she didn't care. She was so sure of herself, so sure I wouldn't do anything about it. That was her first mistake. As she left that night, I made a decision. I wasn't just going to sit around and let her make a fool out of me. I needed a plan, a way to turn the tables, to make her feel the same pain and humiliation she was inflicting on me. I started with the basics. I went through her things when she was in tea around her phone, her emails, even her social media accounts. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. A trail of messages, some innocent enough, others blatantly flirtatious, leading to one name, Eric. Eric was everything she said she wanted in a man, tall, confident, successful. But what she didn't know was that I was about to turn her fantasy into a nightmare. I wasn't going to confront her, not yet. No, that would be too easy, too quick. I needed to be patient, to gather everything I needed before making my move. I started tracking her movements, following her when she left the house. It was surprisingly easy. She was so wrapped up in her new life that she didn't even notice. I watched her meet Eric at a hotel, their embraces, their laughter. It was like a knife to the heart every time, but I didn't look away. This was my fuel, my motivation. Every detail was noted, every encounter photographed. I compiled everything: dates, times, places. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about survival, about taking back control of my life. But I wasn't going to act just yet. I wanted to make sure when I did, it would be something she'd never forget. She had torn our marriage apart, and I was going to make sure she regretted it. When she came home that night, she was all smiles, humming to herself as she got ready for bed. She didn't notice the coldness in my eyes, or the fact that I didn't ask her how her night was. I didn't need to soon enough. She'd have plenty of time to think about all the questions she never bothered to answer. I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with possibilities. This was just the beginning, but I could already taste the satisfaction that would come when she realized just how badly she had underestimated me. She thought she was so clever, so untouchable. But little did she know, the game had only just begun, and I was about to change the rules. Let me know when you're ready for the next part. This story is only getting D. The weeks that followed were a test of patience. Every time she walked through the door with that smug smile, every time she laughed off my questions or dismissed my concerns, I had to bite my tongue and wait. But the waiting was almost over. I spent my nights carefully crafting the perfect revenge. It wasn't enough just to catch her in the act. I wanted her to feel the same betrayal, the same gut-wrenching pain that I had felt. And I wanted her lover, Eric, to feel it too. I started laying the groundwork by reaching out to an old friend, Jake. Jake was the kind of guy who knew the right people. We met at a bar one evening, a place far enough from home that there was no chance of running into anyone we knew. As we sat down with our drinks, Jake leaned in, lowering his voice. "So, what is going on? You sounded pretty serious on the phone." I took a deep breath, knowing this was the point of no return. "I need your help with something." "Delicate." He raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Go on." I explained the situation, laying it all out: the affair, the lies, the need for payback. Jake listened intently, nodding occasionally but staying silent until I finished. "So you want to ruin them both," he said, more a statement than a question. I nodded. "I want them to regret everything." Jake sat back, taking a sip of his drink. "I can help you, but you need to be sure about this. Once we start, there is no turning back." "I'm sure," I said without hesitation. "I've never been more sure of anything." He grinned, a wicked glint in his eye. "All right then. Here's what we'll do." Over the next hour, we hashed out the details. It was going to be a multi-step process, each phase designed to dismantle their lives piece by piece. It would start with subtle moves, just enough to make them uneasy, to start unraveling the threads of their perfect little affair. The first step was setting the trap. I had already collected enough evidence of the affair to confront her, but that wasn't the plan. No, the plan was to make sure they knew something was coming but didn't know when or how, to make them paranoid, to turn them against each other. Jake had a contact who could help with the next part, a private investigator who was very good at digging up dirt. The goal was to find every little skeleton in Eric's closet and use it against him. Affairs, debts, anything that could be leveraged. Once we had that, we'd use it to plant seeds of doubt in both their minds. Back at home, I started playing the role of the loving, unsuspecting husband. I brought her flowers, cooked her favorite meals, acted as if everything was normal. She was visibly relieved, probably thinking that I had no idea what was going on. It was almost laughable how easy it was to deceive her, how she mistook my kindness for ignorance. Meanwhile, Jake was working on the other side of the plan. It didn't take long for the investigator to come through with the goods. Eric was not the squeaky clean guy he appeared to be. He had a history: old girlfriends, shady business deals, even a run-in with the law that had been quietly swept under the rug. This was the ammunition I needed. I started leaving anonymous tips, first to Eric, then to my wife, just enough to make them question each other. A mysterious text here, a cryptic email there. Nothing too obvious, but enough to make them wonder who was watching, who knew. The tension was palpable. I could see it in the way she started to jump at small noises, how she checked her phone constantly, as if expecting something bad to happen. Eric, too, started acting differently. The few times I followed them, I could see the cracks forming. They were more cautious, more distant. The thrill was gone, replaced by a creeping fear that something was wrong, and that S when I knew it was time to escalate. I arranged for a package to be delivered to Eric S' office, an envelope filled with copies of the photos I had taken of him and my wife. But that wasn't all. I included a note, typed and unsigned, that read, "You are not as clever as you think. There's more where this came from." The next day she came home, pale and shaken. She tried to act normal, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She didn't mention anything about the package. I figured Eric had kept it to himself, trying to figure out how to deal with it. But it didn't matter. The seed had been planted. As we sat down to dinner that night, she was unusually quiet, picking at her food. I could feel the tension radiating off her, and it took everything in me not to smile. "What is wrong?" I asked, feigning concern. She looked up, forcing a smile. "Nothing. Just a long day." I nodded, pretending to believe her. "If there's anything you want to talk about, I am here." She shook her head. "I am fine, really." But she wasn't fine, and neither was Eric. They were both unraveling, just as I had planned. The trap was set, and soon enough it would snap shut, leaving them with no way out. The days following the delivery of the package were a masterclass in unraveling. I watched as the once confident woman I married began to crumble before my eyes. She was more withdrawn, her eyes constantly darting to her phone, her fingers nervously tapping against anything within reach. Eric, from what I could gather, was no better off. The cracks in their facade were deepening, and it was only a matter of time before everything fell apart. One evening she came home later than usual, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly as she fumbled with the keys. She didn't notice me watching her from the kitchen, a glass of wine in my hand, as she finally got the door open and practically stumbled inside. "Hey," I called out, feigning casualness. "Everything okay?" She jumped at the sound of my voice, clearly startled. "Yeah," she replied, her voice strained. "Just tired. It's been a long day." I nodded, pretending to accept her excuse. "You look exhausted. Why don't you sit down and relax for a bit?" She hesitated, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for something or someone. "I'm fine," she insisted, her voice almost too tight. "I just need a shower." She barely made it up the stairs before I heard the bathroom door slam shut. I could hear the water running, but I knew she wasn't just taking a shower. She was unraveling, trying to keep it together in a situation that was rapidly spiraling out of her control. I followed her upstairs, staying quiet as I approached the bathroom door. The sound of running water masked the quiet sobs I knew she was trying to stifle. My heart should have ached for her, but it didn't. I was too focused on what was coming next. The shower eventually stopped and she emerged, wrapped in a towel, her hair dripping wet. She looked like a ghost of the woman she once was, haunted by secrets she thought she could keep hidden forever. "You sure you're okay?" I asked again, making sure my voice was full of concern, even though inside I was relishing every moment of this. She nodded weakly, avoiding eye contact. "Yeah, just tired." We both knew that was a lie. But I let it slide, watching as she disappeared into the bedroom to get dressed. I could almost feel her mind racing, trying to figure out who knew about her affair, how much they knew, and what she should do next. That night she barely spoke during dinner. Her eyes kept flicking to her phone, the screen lighting up every few minutes with messages that she quickly dismissed. I could only imagine they were from Eric, both of them panicking, wondering how to control the situation. But it was too late. The wheels were already in motion. 2 days later, I decided to push them further. I arranged for another package to be delivered to Eric S.'s office. This time it contained an audio recording a conversation I had managed to capture between them during one of their clandestine meetings. It wasn't just any conversation, though it was one where they discussed the possibility of running away together, leaving me behind without a second thought. The effect was immediate. That evening, she came home looking like she hadn't slept in days. Her face was ashen, her hands trembling more than ever. She didn't even pretend this time. She went straight to the bedroom, locking herself inside for hours. I let her be. She needed to feel this, to stew in her own fear and paranoia. Meanwhile, I stayed downstairs, my mind racing with the next steps. I knew it wouldn't be long before Eric broke. He was the weak link in this equation, and I had a feeling he would crack under the pressure sooner rather than later. Sure enough, the next morning, I overheard her on the phone, her voice a frantic whisper as she tried to calm him down. "You need to relax, Eric," she hissed. "We can't afford to lose our heads over this." "I think someone's following me," he nearly shouted, his voice trembling with fear. "I can't do this anymore. Shut up," she snapped, her tone icy. "You're going to ruin everything if you don't calm down. Just stick to the plan, okay?" She was trying to hold it together, but even she knew it was a losing battle. They were on the edge, and it wouldn't take much more to push them over. That night, I planted the final seed of doubt. I left an anonymous voicemail on Eric S.'s phone, using a voice changer to mask my identity. "You think you are safe? You are not. I know everything, and soon the whole world will too. You are both going to pay for this." I knew he'd crack after hearing that. And I wasn't wrong. The next day I saw him pacing outside the hotel where they usually met, his phone clutched in his hand, his face a mask of desperation. He looked like a man on the brink of collapse, and that's exactly what I wanted. That evening she came home, a mixture of fear and frustration etched into her features. She didn't speak much, her mind clearly elsewhere, and I didn't push. I didn't need to. They were doing all the work for me now, driving themselves insane with worry. The unraveling was nearly complete. All that was left was to watch as they destroyed each other, piece by piece. And when the time was right, I would deliver the final blow. I could see it coming, everything was building toward a crescendo, and the moment was almost upon us. Eric and my wife were both on the edge, their nerves frayed, their carefully constructed facade crumbling. They were spiraling, and soon they'd have no choice but to face the consequences of their actions. It was a Thursday evening when it all came to a head. She had been increasingly distant, and I could tell she was barely holding on. She spent most of her time locked in the bedroom or on the phone with Eric, their conversations growing more frantic and desperate. The fear in her eyes was unmistakable now, but she still hadn't cracked. Not yet. That night, I decided it was time for the final push. I needed to force their hand, to make them do something drastic. I needed them to destroy each other, and I knew exactly how to make it happen. After dinner, when she retreated upstairs, I slipped out of the house and drove to Eric S.'s place. I knew he'd be home, he was too scared to leave his apartment these days. I parked a block away and walked the rest of the distance, keeping to the shadows. My heart was pounding, but it wasn't fear, it was the anticipation of what was about to unfold. I reached his apartment building and made my way up to his floor. I knew the layout well enough by now, having followed him here several times before. I found his door, took a deep breath, and knocked. It took a moment, but eventually, I heard the sound of footsteps approaching. The door opened a crack, and there he was, Eric, looking disheveled and paranoid, his eyes wide with fear. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "Relax," I said, my tone calm and controlled. "I am just here to talk." "Talk about what?" His eyes darted around nervously as if expecting someone to jump out of the shadows. "About your little problem?" I replied, leaning casually against the doorframe. "I know you've been getting some unsettling messages lately." His face paled, and I knew I had him. "What do you know about that?" "More than you think," I said, my voice low and menacing. "I know about you and her. I know about the affair, and I know about the lies." He swallowed hard, his hands trembling. "What do you want?" I leaned in closer, my eyes locking onto his. "I want you to do something for me, something that will make all of this go away." He stared at me, desperate and confused. What do you mean?" I could see the fear in his eyes, but there was also a glimmer of hope. He wanted out, and he was willing to do whatever it took to get there. "Leave," I said simply. "Pack up and leave town. Disappear. And if you do, I'll make sure all of this goes away. No more threats, no more harassment, just freedom." He blinked, taken aback by the simplicity of the offer. "That is it? Just leave? That's it," I confirmed. "But you have to do it now. Tonight. before things get any worse." He hesitated, and for a moment I thought he might refuse. But then his shoulders slumped, and he nodded, defeated. "All right, I'll go." "Good," I said, stepping back. "I'll give you until morning. After that, I can't promise anything." He closed the door without another word, and I knew he was going to do it. He was going to run, and in doing so, he would destroy everything they had built together. I left the apartment building, feeling a sense of triumph as I made my way back to the car. But there was one more thing I needed to do before the night was over. Back at home, I found her sitting on the edge of the bed, her phone clutched in her hand, her face pale and drawn. She looked up as I entered the room, her eyes full of questions she was too afraid to ask. "Is everything okay?" I asked, keeping my voice steady as if nothing was amiss. She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. No, it's not." I sat down beside her, placing a hand on her knee. "What is wrong?" For a moment she just stared at me, her emotions battling for control. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she finally cracked. I've been lying to you." I feigned surprise, my heart pounding with anticipation. "What are you talking about?" She broke down then, sobbing as she confessed everything, how she had been seeing someone else, how it started as just a fling, but then spiraled out of control. She admitted that she was scared, that she didn't know what to do anymore, that she didn't want to lose everything. I listened, letting her pour it all out, all the while pretending to be the supportive husband she was hoping I'd be. But inside, I was cold, detached. I had already made up my mind. When she finished, she looked at me, desperate for some kind of forgiveness. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never meant for it to go this far." I nodded slowly, my expression unreadable. "It's okay," I said, my voice gentle. "But you need to make things right." She stared at me, confused. "How?" "End it," I said simply. "End it with him, tonight, before it's too late." She hesitated, fear flashing in her eyes. "But what if he—" "It doesn't matter." I cut her off, my voice firm. "You need to do this. It is the only way." She nodded, wiping her tears as she reached for her phone. I watched as she typed out a message, her fingers trembling. When she was done, she showed me the screen as if seeking my approval. "It's over," the message read. I gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Good. Now let's go to bed. It has been a long day." She nodded, clearly exhausted, both physically and emotionally. As she lay down beside me, I could feel the tension leaving her body, the relief of finally unburdening herself. She thought this was the end, that everything would go back to normal now. But she was wrong. This was just the beginning of the end. The next morning, the house was eerily quiet. She had slept fitfully through the night, her mind undoubtedly racing with the weight of everything she had confessed. I, on the other hand, felt a strange sense of calm. The pieces were all in place, and it was only a matter of time before the final dominoes fell. As I sipped my coffee in the kitchen, I heard her moving around upstairs. She was trying to act normal, but I could tell she was nervous. The message she had sent to Eric the night before had been her attempt to salvage what was left of her life, but deep down, she knew it was too late. She came downstairs, her face pale, her eyes hollow. "Morning?" she mumbled, not meeting my gaze as she poured herself a cup of coffee. "Morning," I replied, keeping my tone light. "How did you sleep?" "Not great," she admitted, sinking into a chair across from me. I kept thinking about everything." I nodded sympathetically, though inside, I felt nothing. "It's going to be okay," I said, offering her a reassuring smile. "You did the right thing." She looked at me, her eyes searching mine for any sign of anger or resentment, but I gave her none. I wanted her to believe that I had forgiven her, that we could move past this. That way, when everything finally fell apart, the shock would be even greater. As we sat there, her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen and visibly tensed. I could tell it was a message from Eric. She hesitated for a moment, then picked up the phone and read the message, her face going even paler. "What is wrong?" I asked, pretending not to know. She swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "It's Eric. He leaving. I raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. Leaving? What do you mean? He said he is leaving town, she explained, her voice shaking. He is scared, and he thinks it's the only way to protect himself. I leaned back in my chair, pretending to consider this. Well, maybe it's for the best. You said you wanted to end things with him anyway. I know, but she trailed off, looking lost and confused. I didn't think it would happen like this. I reached across the table and took her hand, squeezing it gently. It's going to be okay, I said, trying to sound comforting. This is a chance for us to start over, to put all of this behind us. She nodded, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. She was too deep in the mess she had created, and now that Eric was running, she was left to face the consequences alone. The rest of the day passed in a tense silence. She spent most of it on her phone, sending frantic messages to Eric, trying to convince him to stay, to talk to her, to not give up. But I knew it was futile. Eric was a coward, and now that he was cornered, he was going to run. By evening, she was a wreck. She barely ate dinner, pushing her food around on her plate as her mind raced. I watched her, my heart cold, knowing that the final blow was coming soon. It came later that night, when she was lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, lost in her thoughts. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, and she grabbed it, hoping for some reassuring words from Eric. But what she saw instead made her sit bolt upright, her breath catching in her throat. It was a text from an unknown number. "It's over," it read. "You've lost everything." She stared at the message, her hands trembling. What is this?" she whispered to herself, panic rising in her voice. I pretended to wake up, rubbing my eyes as I turned to her. "What's wrong?" I asked, feigning concern. She shoved the phone at me, her eyes wide with fear. This message. I don't understand." I took the phone from her, pretending to read the text, though I already knew what it said. "Who sent this?" "I don't know," she whispered, her voice cracking. But what if they know everything?" I handed the phone back to her, shaking my head. "It's probably just a prank. Someone trying to mess with you." "But what if it is not?" she insisted, her voice rising in panic. "What if they really do know?" I put on my best comforting expression, though inside I was savoring every moment of this. "It is going to be okay," I said, trying to calm her down. "Even if someone does know, there's nothing they can do. Eric's leaving and we can move on from this." She nodded, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She was starting to realize just how deep she was in, and how little control she had left. The next morning she was gone before I woke up. I found a note on the kitchen table saying she had gone to work early to clear her head. But I knew better. She was going to see Eric, to try and convince him to stay, to not leave her alone to face the fallout. What she didn't know was that Eric had already left town the night before. He was gone, and he wasn't coming back. He had taken the coward's way out, abandoning her when she needed him the most. By midday, I received a call from Jake. "It's done," he said simply. I knew what he meant, but I asked anyway. "What's done?" "Eric's gone," Jake replied. "He is out of the picture, and the rest, well, you'll see soon enough." I thanked him and hung up, a sense of finality settling over me. The plan was almost complete, and soon, the final piece would fall into place. That evening, she came home, her face a mask of exhaustion and despair. She didn't say a word as she walked past me and headed upstairs, the weight of everything finally crushing her. I followed her, keeping my distance, waiting for the right moment. It came as I stood in the doorway, watching her collapse onto the bed, burying her face in her hands. She was sobbing uncontrollably, the reality of her situation finally hitting her. "Why is this happening?" she cried, her voice muffled by the pillow. "Why is everything falling apart?" I didn't respond immediately, letting her sobs fill the room. Then I stepped inside, my voice cold and distant. "Because you made it happen." She looked up at me, her tear-streaked face full of confusion. What do you mean?" I took a deep breath, the moment of truth finally upon us. "I know everything," I said, my voice icy. "I've known for a long time." Her eyes widened in shock, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to find the words. You know? Yes, I confirmed, my tone cutting like a knife. I know about you and Eric. I know about the affair. I know about the lies, and I know that you thought you could get away with it. She shook her head, her voice trembling. No, you don't understand. It wasn't like that. Dante lied to me, I snapped, my patience finally wearing thin. I've seen everything, I've heard everything, and I've had enough. She crumbled then, the full weight of her actions crashing down on her. Please, she begged, her voice desperate. Please don't leave me. I am sorry. I didn't mean for it to happen. It's too late for that, I said coldly. You made your choice, and now you have to live with the consequences. She reached out to me, her hands shaking, but I stepped back, out of her reach. Please, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I'll do anything. Just don't leave me. I stared at her, my heart hardened against her pleas. It's over, I said, my voice final. You've lost everything, and there is nothing you can do to change that. With that, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her to face the ruins of the life she had so carelessly destroyed. I left her sobbing on the bed, her cries echoing in my ears as I walked out of the bedroom. There was no satisfaction in this moment, no sense of victory, just a cold, hollow feeling that settled deep in my chest. I knew what was coming next, and I was ready for it. Downstairs, I grabbed a drink from the kitchen, letting the cold glass press against my forehead as I tried to clear my mind. This was what I had wanted, wasn't it? To make her pay, to make her feel the same pain and betrayal she had inflicted on me? But now that it was happening, all I felt was emptiness. My phone buzzed on the counter and I glanced at the screen. It was Jake. It's a time, he said when I answered. Are you sure? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Positive, he replied. We've got everything we need. This ends tonight. I took a deep breath, nodding even though he couldn't see me. All right, do it. Jake hung up, and I stood there for a moment, staring at the phone in my hand. This was it, the final blow, the culmination of everything I had been planning, everything I had been working toward. I went back upstairs, finding her still curled up on the bed, her sobs reduced to soft, pitiful whimpers. She didn't even look up as I approached, too lost in her despair. I sat down on the edge of the bed, the weight of what I was about to do pressing down on me. We need to talk, I said, my voice quiet but firm. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen from crying. Please, she whispered, her voice raw. I am sorry. I'll do anything to fix this. There's nothing to fix, I replied coldly. You broke everything, and now it is too late to put it back together. She shook her head, fresh tears streaming down her face. No, it can't be too late. We can make this work. I'll do whatever it takes, I swear. I sighed, the weight of it all settling over me like a heavy blanket. You don't understand, I said, my voice hollow. This isn't just about us. This is about what you did. The lies, the betrayal, everything. And now you're going to have to face the consequences. What do you mean? She asked, her voice trembling. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was about to happen. You'll see soon enough. As if on cue, the doorbell rang, echoing through the house. She flinched at the sound, her eyes wide with fear. Who is that? Let's find out, I said, standing up and heading downstairs. She followed me, her footsteps hesitant, like she was afraid of what was waiting for her. I opened the door, and there stood Jake, flanked by two men in suits. Her eyes went wide with recognition, and she stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. What's going on? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake stepped forward, his expression unreadable. We are here to settle a few things. She looked at me, her eyes pleading. What did you do? I didn't answer her. Instead, I gestured for Jake and the men to come inside. They stepped past her, their presence commanding, as if they were about to pass judgment. Mrs. Carter, one of the men said, his voice firm and authoritative. We have some questions for you. She shook her head, backing away from them, her fear palpable. No, I don't understand. What is this? Jake stepped forward, his tone cold and detached. It is over, Emily. Everything. We've been watching you and Eric for months. The affair, the lies, the money you funneled through his accounts to cover your tracks, we know it all. Her face went white as a sheet, and she turned to me, her eyes wide with disbelief. You did this? I warned you, I said, my voice devoid of emotion. I told you there would be consequences. She stared at me, tears spilling down her cheeks. But you can do this. You can ruin my life. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The truth was out, and there was no going back. The men stepped forward, producing papers that they handed to her. We have enough evidence to press charges, one of them said. You are looking at multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement, among other things. She looked down at the papers in her hands, her whole body trembling as the reality of the situation sank in. This can't be happening, she whispered, her voice shaking. It's happening, Jake said, his tone flat. And there's nothing you can do to stop it. She collapsed to her knees, the papers slipping from her fingers as she broke down completely. I watched her, feeling a strange mix of emotions, anger, sorrow, and a bitter satisfaction. But there was one more thing I needed to do. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small envelope, handing it to Jake. He took it without a word, knowing exactly what it was. Serve her these too, I said, my voice cold and detached. I want her to know that this is the end. Jake nodded, stepping forward to hand her the envelope. She looked up at him, her eyes full of confusion and fear, as she took it with shaking hands. What is this? She asked, her voice barely audible. Divorce papers, Jake said simply. It's over, Emily. Your marriage, your life as you knew it, everything. She stared at the envelope in her hands, her mind clearly struggling to process what was happening. You are leaving me? I nodded, my voice firm. I told you there would be consequences. She looked at me, her eyes pleading, but I could see the realization dawning on her. There was no coming back from this. She had destroyed everything, and now she was paying the price. As Jake and the men left, she stayed on the floor, clutching the divorce papers to her chest, her sobs echoing through the empty house. I stood there for a moment, watching her, the woman I had once loved, now reduced to a broken, shattered mess. I should have felt triumphant, but all I felt was a deep, aching emptiness. I turned and walked away, leaving her alone to face the ruins of her life. The final blow had been dealt, and there was nothing left to say. I drove for what felt like hours, aimlessly navigating the dark, empty streets. The city lights blurred around me as I tried to make sense of everything that had just happened. The finality of it all weighed heavily on me, and the silence in the car was deafening. I should have felt relief, or maybe even some twisted sense of accomplishment. But instead, all I felt was an overwhelming emptiness. It was like everything I had planned for, everything I had worked toward, had left me with nothing but a hollow void. Eventually, I pulled into a quiet parking lot overlooking the river. The moonlight reflected off the water, casting a soft glow over the scene. I sat there for a long time, staring out at the water, trying to process the events that had just unfolded. Emily had been the center of my life for so long, even after everything she had done. Now she was gone, and I was left to pick up the pieces of whatever was left. The reality of it all started to sink in, and I realized that this wasn't just the end of my marriage. It was the end of a part of myself, a part that I wasn't sure I could ever get back. My phone buzzed, breaking the silence. I glanced at the screen. It was a message from Jake. It's done. She's gone. I stared at the message for a moment before replying, thanks, gone. The word felt so final, so irreversible. I knew what he meant. Emily had been taken away, her life in ruins, and now there was nothing left to do but move on. But how do you move on from something like this? How do you rebuild when everything you thought you knew, everything you thought you were, has been shattered? I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. There was no going back. I had made my choice, and now I had to live with it. But what did that mean? What was left for me now? The sound of my phone buzzing again pulled me out of my thoughts. Another message from Jake. You should head back home. There's something you need to see. I hesitated for a moment before starting the car and pulling out of the parking lot. The drive back felt like a blur, my mind racing with thoughts of what could possibly be waiting for me. When I pulled up to the house, everything was quiet. The lights were off, and the street was empty, save for my car. I got out and walked up the driveway, my heart pounding in my chest as I approached the front door. I hesitated before opening it, half expecting to find anything that would explain the gnawing feeling in my gut. But when I stepped inside, the house was silent, too silent. I moved through the rooms, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The kitchen was untouched, the living room as we had left it earlier. Everything was in its place, but something felt wrong. I could feel it in the air, a tension, a heaviness that I couldn't quite place. As I climbed the stairs, the feeling intensified. My heart raced as I approached the bedroom, the door slightly ajar. I pushed it open, the creak of the hinges sending a shiver down my spine. And there she was, Emily, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring down at the floor, the divorce papers crumpled in her hands. Her hair was a mess, her face streaked with tears. She looked up as I entered, her eyes hollow and empty. "You're back," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, unable to find the words. The sight of her like this, so broken and defeated, sent a wave of emotions crashing over me. I had done this. I had brought her to this point. I didn't know where else to go, she continued, her voice trembling. They took everything. They said I have nothing left. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. She was right. I had taken everything from her, left her with nothing but the ruins of a life she had once cherished. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I am so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." I didn't know what to say. There was nothing I could say that would make this right. We had both lost so much, and there was no undoing the damage that had been done. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, the silence between us filled with all the words we couldn't say. Then, slowly, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her alone with her regrets. As I made my way back downstairs, the weight of everything that had happened pressed down on me like a heavy burden. I had gotten my revenge, but at what cost? I had destroyed her life, but I had also destroyed a part of myself in the process. I reached the bottom of the stairs and paused, staring at the front door. I could leave. I could walk away and never look back, start over somewhere new. But I knew that wasn't an option. Not really. With a heavy sigh, I turned away from the door and headed into the living room. I sank into the couch, my mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. In the end, it didn't matter. The damage was done, and now all I could do was pick up the pieces and try to rebuild. But deep down, I knew that things would never be the same. I had crossed a line and there was no going back. The fallout is heavy, and the emotional toll is undeniable. Let me know when you are ready for the days after that night passed in a haze. Emily stayed in the house, moving like a ghost through the rooms, barely speaking, barely eating. I avoided her as much as possible, retreating to the guest room and burying myself in anything that could distract me from the emptiness that had taken root in my chest. The silence between us was unbearable, but neither of us knew how to break it. There was nothing left to say. The life we had built together was gone, shattered by betrayal and revenge. And now we were just two broken people, trying to figure out how to move forward in the ruins. I found myself constantly questioning everything I had done. At night, when sleep wouldn't come, I would lie in bed replaying the events that had led us to this point, wondering if it had all been worth it. The satisfaction of revenge had long since faded, replaced by a gnawing guilt that I couldn't shake. I had won, but in doing so, I had lost everything that mattered. One evening, about a week after that fateful night, I found her sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the television. The screen was on, but the volume was muted, the flickering images reflecting in her vacant eyes. She didn't look up as I entered the room, but I could tell she knew I was there. I hesitated in the doorway, unsure of what to do, what to say, but something inside me pushed me forward, and I slowly walked over to the couch and sat down beside her. For a long time, we just sat there in silence, neither of us knowing how to start the conversation we both needed to have. Eventually, it was Emily who spoke first, her voice barely a whisper. "I can stay here," she said, her eyes still fixed on the screen. I can't be here anymore." Her words hit me like a blow, but I couldn't blame her. The house was filled with memories, both good and bad, and staying here, surrounded by the remnants of our broken life, would only prolong the pain. I understand, I replied quietly. Do you have somewhere to go? She nodded, finally turning to look at me. My sister. She said I could stay with her for a while until I figure things out. I could see the defeat in her eyes, the weight of everything she had lost pressing down on her. I wanted to say something, anything, to make it better, but I knew that wasn't possible. The damage was done, and there was no going back. When are you leaving? I asked, my voice thick with emotion. Tomorrow, she whispered. I'll pack my things tonight. I nodded, unable to find the words to express the mixture of sadness and relief that washed over me. Sadness that our life together had come to this, but relief that the suffocating tension in the house would finally ease. That night, I listened as she moved around upstairs, the sounds of her packing echoing through the house. I stayed in the guest room, unable to bring myself to go up there and face the reality of what was happening. I knew it was cowardly, but I didn't care. I just wanted it to be over. The next morning, I found her in the hallway, her bags packed and waiting by the door. She looked at me, her eyes red and puffy from crying, but there was a resolve in her expression that hadn't been there before. I'm sorry, she said, her voice breaking, for everything. I swallowed hard, my throat tight with emotion. Me too. We stood there for a moment, the weight of everything that had happened hanging between us. There were so many things I wanted to say, but I knew that none of them would make a difference now. We had both made our choices, and now we had to live with the consequences. Take care of yourself, Emily, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her eyes filling with tears again. You too. With that, she picked up her bags and walked out the door, leaving me standing alone in the empty house. The sound of the door closing behind her was like a final, crushing blow, and I felt something inside me break. For a long time, I just stood there, staring at the door, trying to make sense of the mess my life had become. But there was no making sense of it. Everything I had known, everything I had been, was gone. In the weeks that followed, I tried to put the pieces of my life back together. I returned to work, throwing myself into my job in an attempt to drown out the emptiness that had taken root in my soul. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the lingering sense of loss that followed me everywhere I went. I heard from Jake a few times, checking in on me, offering to meet up for a drink or to talk, but I declined. I didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to relive the events that had led me to this point. I just wanted to forget, to move on. But forgetting was easier said than done. Nights were the hardest. The silence of the house was deafening, a constant reminder of what I had lost. I found myself lying awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of Emily, of what we had once been, and of what I had done to destroy it. I knew I had to move on, to find a way to rebuild my life, but every step forward felt like dragging myself through quicksand, the weight of guilt and regret pulling me down. I had gotten my revenge, but at what cost? Eventually, I started seeing a therapist, hoping that talking about everything might help me make sense of it all. The sessions were difficult, forcing me to confront the pain and anger that I had buried deep inside. But slowly, I started to untangle the web of emotions that had consumed me. The therapist asked me to write a letter to Emily, not to send, but just to express everything I was feeling. It was one of the hardest things I had ever done, but as I poured my heart out onto the page, I felt a small sense of release, as if a tiny piece of the weight I had been carrying was lifted. In the letter, I admitted my guilt, my regret, and my sorrow for what had happened. I acknowledged the mistakes we had both made and the pain we had caused each other. And in the end, I wished her happiness, even though I knew it was something we could never find together. I never sent the letter. Instead, I tucked it away in a drawer, a reminder of the lessons I had learned and the consequences of the choices I had made. As the weeks turned into months, I slowly started to rebuild my life. I reconnected with friends, took up new hobbies, and began to find small moments of peace in the chaos that had once consumed me. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the pain felt as fresh as it had the day she walked out the door. But I kept moving forward, one step at a time. I never heard from Emily again. I assumed she had started over, just as I was trying to do, and while the thought of her still brought a pang of sadness, I knew it was better this way. We had both done enough damage to each other, and it was time to let go. In the end, I realized that revenge had cost me more than I could have ever imagined. It had torn apart the life I had once cherished and left me with nothing but emptiness. But it had also taught me something valuable, that holding on to anger and pain only leads to destruction. Letting go was the hardest thing I had ever done, but it was also the only way to find peace. And slowly, painfully, I began